This video, I'm going to teach you guys about opposition. Okay, so let's take you through some examples. The easiest one is where the kings are directly facing off in front of each other. Okay, so in this position, if it's black's turn to move, then black has the weaker king because then the king has to step aside or go backwards. Let's make it go backwards just because it's easier to see first of all. Then white's king gets to make progress into black's position. So you would go king here, and you can see white's king is marching up. And again, black's turn to move. Black's king has to go backwards, let's say. Then again, white's king gets to go forward and make progress here. And so white is making a foray into black's position. White's king is stronger, and it's kind of bullying black's king. Okay, so that's, we would say white has the opposition if it's black's turn to move. Okay, now opposition is closely related to outflanking. Okay, so in this position, black doesn't necessarily have to just go backwards and allow white's king to come forward. He can make it a little bit more challenging by going to the side, right? So let's say black's king goes to the side somewhere. Now here, just taking the opposition again with king to c4 doesn't really help white, because then black's king will just go back to the original square. Then white's king takes the opposition again, and we didn't make any progress, right? We just followed black's king around. So the whole point of taking the opposition is not to keep taking the opposition, but to outflank, which means we kind of go, flank means side, right? So we go diagonally forward from the side. We kind of outflank black and go make progress. So white would go king e5, and diagonally we made progress into black's position. So let's say black's king again is trying to stop us from going forward into his position. So he brings the king back around, king d7, and tries to stay in front of our king. So our king cannot make forward progress. Now here, we would just take the opposition again with king d5. And now again, we put the ball in black's court. It's like, okay, you move aside, right? And let's say black's king goes to the side. Now again, we outflank. We took the opposition to outflank now. So we would go king here, c6. And we diagonally made progress into black's position. We're getting closer and closer to black's side, right? So back here, taking the opposition, which means making it black's turn to move here, allows us to make progress in any one of these ways, whether it's straightforward or to the side with an outflanking. Okay, these would be outflanking. Now, the easiest way to tell who has the opposition is to see how many squares are between the kings, and then see whose turn it is to move, okay? So if it's an odd number of squares, like 1 here, 1 square, then we want it to be our opponent's turn to move. Then we know our king is stronger, because the opponent's king will have to run away, and then our king is coming forward, right? If it was white's turn to move here with an odd number of squares, then our king is weaker, and black's king is going to bully and push us back and outflank us, right? And this principle is important when you're considering opposition where the kings are maybe on the opposite sides of the board. So let's choose another example here. Here, it's not so clear because the kings aren't directly facing across from each other. They're kind of facing across from each other on the diagonal. The good thing for us is that the same principles apply. We just count the number of squares in between. If it's an odd number of squares, then whoever's turn it is to move has the weaker king. Okay, so we'll see it play out here. It's black's turn to move, which means black has the weaker king. So when the kings come in front of each other, let's say he goes anywhere. First of all, if the king just goes f4, then we can easily make progress up the board, right? We would just go king d4, and black's king will not be able to come and stop us from going forward into black's position. So back here, black might try and stay in front of our king with king e5. Now, of course, we could just outflank and keep making progress up the board. Or let's say we particularly want to go forward on this line. Then we would just go king e3. Again, then we transfer over to our previous example. Direct opposition in front of each other. Odd number of squares black to move. White will be able to outflank and make progress. Let's say black comes forward again with king e6. Then we retake the opposition on the e line. And we can keep marching up this e line. All because we took diagonal opposition back here with an odd number of squares. So the same principle applies to diagonals, okay? You just make it an odd number of squares in between the kings with your opponent's turn to move, okay? Now this works even with, we call this distant opposition, okay? Same principles apply. You just count the number of squares in between, and you want it to be an odd number of squares, like here, 5, with your opponent's turn to move. So whoever's turn it is to move here will have the weaker king. And it's black's turn to move. And we'll see this play out. So let's say the kings approach each other. So black goes king d6. We go king d2, sorry, king d5, king d3. And we saw how distant opposition translated into close direct opposition with black's turn to move. And white will outflank the king. Or just make straightforward brute force progress forward, right? Our king is stronger. So we were able to tell this all the way from back here with the kings so far away from each other. Just count the number of squares in between. Make sure it's an odd number with your opponent's turn to move. And even if black doesn't just go straight forward, let's say he goes e7, trying to trick us. Well, then we have a choice. Like, which square should we go to, e2 or e1? Again, if you go to e2, it's a mistake because then there's an even number of squares with your opponent's turn to move, not an odd number. So I'll show you why it's a mistake. Let's say we go e2. Now, when the kings approach each other, black's king will be stronger and it will push us back. So let's say king e6, king e3, king e5. And we see it's our turn to move. We have to run back, and then black's king is bullying us. Sorry, not there, e4. Black's king is stronger, see? So back here, when the king goes to e7, we have to choose e1 because it keeps an odd number of squares in between, 5 squares, with our opponent's turn to move. So this is the move that would allow us to make progress. Seems counterintuitive, right? But now when the kings approach each other, king e6, king e2, king e5, king e3, and black's turn to move, and we already covered this example. Black's turn to move, we will either get to outflank, or we will get to go straight forward, whichever. Our king is stronger. Okay, so that's how distant opposition translates into direct opposition. Just make sure there's same principles apply. Make sure there's an odd number of squares with your opponent's turn to move. Now this is on the diagonals. Same principles apply again, okay? So if it's black's turn to move here, and we want to see, is king h7 a mistake or is it a good move? Count the number of squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which means king h7 is a good move. It'll keep an odd number of squares in between with the opponent's turn to move. So king h7, and now when the kings approach each other, you'll see why black's king is stronger. Let's say king c2, king g6, king d3, king f5, and this became a previous example we looked at with the diagonal opposition, and black's king will be able to force our king backwards. Now this translated into the first example we looked at, the direct opposition with our opponent's turn to move, right? Black's king will bully us backwards. So that's how diagonal opposition, distant diagonal opposition, also translates into direct opposition. Same principles apply. This is a bit harder to tell because there's no clear straight lines that the kings can engage in battle with each other. There's no diagonals, no clear diagonals. So here the rule is you just make a square with the corners being the same color. So if it's black's turn to move, and you have a choice, like what possible square do I go to? First of all, any square on this line would be a mistake. Let's say king e7 or king e6, whichever, because now we're putting the ball in white's court, and white can decide should he go to that square or that square, and he can choose the right one, which would be this one, e3, because there's an odd number of squares in between with black's turn to move. So white has the opposition here, the stronger king. So black would just avoid this line for now and just keep that square rule that I told you with the same colored corner. So either king f6 or king g7, they both work. They both will take the opposition in the long run. So we'll see how this works out. Let's say king here, king f6. And now when the kings start approaching each other, first of all, if the king ever goes into this line, we already covered, black will get to choose what square he goes to, which means black will choose a right square and take the opposition. And if white avoids this line and just stays on, let's say, d3, then white king will again choose a square that's the same colored square that makes this a square or a rectangle, right? And actually this is a diagonal opposition. So king f5, and we already looked at this. The diagonal opposition, we looked at it in a previous example. White's turn to move, white's king is weaker. So when the kings are apart like that and there's no straightforward diagonal or same line, remember, just make the square and make sure the corners of the square are the same color. So black's king does not want to be here with white's turn to move. So he would go here, okay, or here or there. Then this becomes the square or the rectangle, and all the corners are the same color, which is kind of a heuristic or a mental shortcut to know that we're on the right track. Our king is stronger. Now this is just a nice example I'll go through here that shows the power of the king, how we can use opposition and outflanking to our advantage. Okay, this example is taken from Dvoretsky's Endgame manual, which is kind of a one-stop resource for, I guess, if you want to become a grandmaster. All the grandmasters use it to kind of learn their fundamental endgames. Okay, the rule here is that black can only move his rook once in the game. So if, let's say, black uses the rook once, then he can never move the rook again, which means the rook can only be used for the last checkmating move, which means all other progress that black needs to make has to be done with the king. So the question here is, if it's black's turn to move, which square does he go to? Does he go to this square or this square? Both look like they're making progress, but one will draw and one will win. Okay, you can pause the video, try and think it out, whatever. The answer is, we use the rules of opposition. So we count the number of squares in between, 3, 4, 5, 6. We want to turn this into an odd number with white's turn to move. So we would go here. That's the one move that wins the game here. Okay, and you'll see why black's king is stronger. So if you start going up the board, this translated into direct opposition, right? One square in between. Now black gets to bully white's king. Now, of course, we can't just checkmate right away because the king will take it. So we take opposition one more time and then checkmate, right? So black's king was able to bully white's king just by taking the opposition here. Now, of course, it's not so simple. Like, white will try and make our life harder. So we'll look at that. But first, let me show you why this square would not work. Okay, because when we go to this line, we put the ball in white's court, and he gets to decide what square he wants to go to. And one of these will take the opposition. And it's, if you guys can figure it out, it's this one. Because this one keeps an odd number of squares in between, 3, 4, 5. With black start to move. So we go here. And now when the kings approach each other, you'll see that white's king is stronger. Boom. And we will not let black make progress. If he goes to the side, we'll just keep shoulder checking him forever. Black's king can make no progress. And if black's king cannot make progress, then he cannot push us to the back rank where he needs to checkmate us, right? Okay, so now even here it's not so clear. Like when we choose the right square, let's say white, we do this thing with the kings approach each other. Sure, black's king is stronger, but white's king doesn't just need to go backwards. He can also just go to the side, right? And you might ask yourself, okay, how do we make progress here? Well, this is where we use the opposition to outflank our opponent and make progress that way. Like I said, the two concepts are related. So we take the opposition one more time. White's king cannot go here because the rook is controlling it. It has to step back. And here, just straightforward taking the opposition doesn't help us. We're repeating the position. Like, this is not going to help us to take the opposition here. So back here, this is where we outflank. We make progress diagonally forward on a line where it doesn't matter so much because white's king cannot come here and challenge us to shoulder check us, right? Now here white's king could go here, but then this is a checkmate and black wins. And if the king goes back anywhere, let's say he goes here, then we retake the opposition. And again, we just outflank. Retake the opposition. And I guess here we don't need to outflank, we can just checkmate our opponent. So opposition and outflanking, we're using them together to make progress, right, diagonally. And I mean, I don't think I'll go to more subtleties. This is where kind of a coach comes in because you can ask a lot of questions. I can go through every variation. I can make you try and solve the puzzle by yourself, stuff like that. You guys can just play this out with an engine even and see how this works out, whatever. But that's a good example from that Dvoretsky's Endgame manual. Let's look at another example where opposition plays a role. Let's use this example. Okay, so this happens in a ton of games, and you need to know how to draw this with black, even when you're down a pawn. Okay. Now, let's say it's white's turn to move. Okay, so let's say he goes there, and the question is, what square should the king go to? Now, actually, all the squares are good right now. They're all drawing pretty much. But still, in principle, you should try and follow the right principles, right? You try and stay, you go to a square where white cannot take the opposition on you. This square, white can take the opposition. Now his king is stronger than you. Odd number squares with your turn to move. We already looked at that. But if you go to this square, then we see that white's king cannot go to the square where he wants to take the opposition because his own pawn is occupying it. And this crucial fact is going to help us draw the game. Okay, so here white would have to go there. Then we take the opposition. Odd number squares, white's turn to move. Cannot make progress anywhere forward, which means he has to move the pawn forward. And now if this position keeps recurring, then we'll get the same position here, somewhere at the end of the board, and this will actually be a stalemate. And I'll show you guys how this works. So let me play through these moves. We go straight back, remember. We go to a square where white cannot take the opposition because his own pawn is blocking that square where he wants to go. So we would not go here because then white's king can take the opposition. That's a bad move for black. So straight back, stay in front of the pawn, right? Stay in front of the king. Stay in front of the pawn. Stay in front of the king. Shoulder check him so he cannot make progress. Make the pawn move first. We just keep repeating this until this end position where you see this is a stalemate. It's a draw. Black's king cannot go anywhere at all safely, and he's not in check, so it's a stalemate. It's a draw. Okay. And just one more little heuristic or mental thing to watch out for is you want the pawn to come here with check. If it comes here with check, then you know you can make a draw. All right, just something to look out for. If the pawn ended up coming here with your king here and it was not a check, then you would lose the game because it would be your turn to move out, and white's king would go forward and he promotes. Okay, anyways. Again, as a teacher, I would play this out with you, and we would drill this a few times until you got automatic, so that you can dish it out even in a blitz game, bullet game, 10 seconds left, whatever. Just one more time here. We go to a square where white cannot take the opposition, and this is going to help us draw. Then we take the opposition, and the idea to take the opposition is to not let the king come forward and not let us push us back, okay? This becomes more clear in another example. So let's look at this example here. In this position, whoever's turn it is to move will lose the game, okay, because their king will be weaker. So opposition matters here a lot. So here's black's turn to move, which means white will win the game because black's king is weaker and white gets to outflank the king. Remember, outflanking is you make progress diagonally and forward. Of course, if the king just moved backwards, then white can just bully him. And this is really good for white to keep his king in front of the pawn. Okay. And if he goes to the side, we're outflanking him. And then we just keep bullying him. Just outflank him again. And now, when the king is to the side of the pawn like this, and this king is not in front of us, then it's very easy to win the game. Because then the king will just shepherd this pawn all the way forward and protect it from the side. Okay. So to play a few more moves, let's say here, we push the pawn. Now here, we can push the pawn. And again, we get that same position. As you can see, like the beginning position was this, right? And we're getting the same position all the way. Hold on. Sorry, what is going on here? Okay, there we go. Sorry, guys. Let me just edit this. Let's just redo this, okay? Yeah, we outflank here. Here. This is how we win the game. And then this is just an easy win. Once the kings are on the side and this king is no longer in front somewhere, just an easy win. The king will shepherd the pawn all the way forward. And you'll see how. Boom, 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 boom. Just cannot stop us. The pawn goes all the way through, okay? And we did this by using the opposition. So let's say it's you're in an earlier stage of the endgame and you need to look forward and see, is this position a win or not? Well, now you have that simple heuristic. Depends on whose turn it is to move. If you get this position with black's turn to move, our king is stronger and it will make progress. And white will be able to win. And I'm not going to go through the details of this position here, I guess, for lack of time. This is, again, where a coach comes in. They can drill this with you. But you know what to look for. Depends on whose turn it is to move. Here's the same move with white's turn to move. And we just know that it's a draw because black will keep the opposition forever. Never let white's king make progress because white's king wants to go forward, right? And the thing is, if white ever pushes the pawn forward first, without his king in front somewhere, then it's an automatic draw. And we already saw this in one of the previous examples where I showed you how to make a draw on this. We just go here, and white's king cannot keep the opposition because the pawn is occupying that valuable square. This will be a draw. I'll just here show you guys. Stalemate, draw, okay? So that means all the way back here. Now you guys know what to look for. Black's turn to move, what's the result? White wins. White's turn to move, what's the result? Draw, okay? And just look here. This example is like the previous example, except that white has a reserve tempo. Okay, you can always push the pawn to change who has the opposition, which is crucial. So anytime the white king is 2 squares in front of the pawn like this, it's always a win. Because even if it's white's turn to move, okay, he doesn't need to move the king, he can waste a tempo with the pawn. And now we kind of transferred over to the previous position I showed you with black's turn to move, which we know already is a win. Without calculating anything, we just know white's king will get to outflank and make progress and then shepherd the pawn through. Okay, so these are things to look out for, and you saw how opposition can help you find these things out. Let me give a couple more endgames here, even though you guys are probably really tired. Here's another example from Dvoretsky's Endgame manual. Only one move will draw the game for white. He's down a pawn, but he can keep a draw by taking the opposition. Okay, but let's see first what happens if white goes to the wrong square and loses the game. Okay, let's say he goes here, and white thinks I'm gonna go and take these pawns. The problem is black's king is in time, so that when white's king takes the pawn, black takes this one, and then the pawn will promote. Okay. Now back here, black's king had to take diagonal opposition. We know this already. And it was a mistake for black's king to go there. Because here, now white's king would take the opposition, the sideways opposition, odd number of squares in between with black's turn to move. And black will never make progress. White's king will just follow black's king around forever. Sorry, not there. Okay, we return to whatever. Here, this one's tricky. Which square should white go to? It's actually this one, not here. Because if he goes there, black's king goes there, and then white needs that square to take the opposition, but he can't. The own pawn is occupying that square. So here, white would take the distant opposition to accomplish the same thing. Then white's king would just follow the black king forever, and as soon as the black's king got too close, we can still shoulder check him, and never let him take this pawn, which is crucial. Black needs to get that pawn to get one of these pawns through, right? So that's how opposition can help white draw the game here. But again, all the way back to the start here, if white chooses the wrong square, black will win. Okay, so back here, we already saw this, take the diagonal opposition, and then black wins the game, right? That means back here, white's king, the only one that draws is here or here, and actually this is losing too, and we'll see. Same reason, if the white king goes here, it looks like we're taking the opposition, but this pawn is going to make all the difference in the world. White's king will not be able to keep the opposition because he cannot use that square. And if he cannot keep the opposition, like he goes there, then black takes the opposition, and now black wins the game. So for example, if the king goes here, we come around the back, same position, we win the game. And if white's king goes here, we just keep the opposition, cannot go there because we take the pawn. And if he goes up the board, then we use an outflanking procedure here. And white's king cannot take the opposition because his own pawn is in the way. Then we win the game again. These are some complicated lines. I can't really go through it all in the video. But that's why, to avoid the problem of having his own pawn occupy the square he needs, white's king has to go there. That is the only drawing chance here. And this takes distant opposition with 3 squares in between. Okay. So now it's black's turn to move. Goes here, we keep the opposition. Then we keep shoulder checking black's king forever. Black will never be able to progress and take the pawn. And if he goes here, white has to choose the right square. He chooses distant opposition. Again, odd number of squares with black's turn to move. Still, black's king will never be able to make progress. Okay. This is another nice example from that same book, Dvoretsky's Endgame manual. How opposition can help you find the right, sorry, not that square. Whoops. This square, the only drawing chance. I'll go through one last example quickly here, maybe. Maybe, maybe not. Let's just end the video there. Okay, so hope you guys learned something about opposition. Thanks, guys. Let me finish this.